We're going to go ahead and get started today. Thank you so much for coming to the second installment of the Bright Lights Green Sight series. My name is Samit Kadakia. I'm a third-year joint degree student here between the School of Forestry and the School of Management. Today, we're very lucky to have Minh Tsai from Hodo Soy with us. He's going to give a talk talk about his story, talk about his business, and then we're going to have a moderated Q&A, which will be opened up so that you all can ask questions to him after that. I just want to give a little bit of background on Bright Lights Green Sights before we go ahead and get started. The speaker series is this year's Sabin Entrepreneurial Speaker Series, designed to bring in unique entrepreneurs to Yale who are working with cities and working with the environment, and just try to provide a different perspective on what kinds of careers and what kinds of stories you can find in the environmental sector. Today's moderator will be Justin Freiberg, who is the Program Director for Sustainability and the West Campus Urban Farm. He works with both Yale West Campus and the Yale Sustainable Food Program, and he is also a graduate of the Yale School of Forestry. And again, Minh Tsai is the founder of Hodo Soy, a tofu company in Oakland. He is a key driver in increasing education and adoption of tofu. So let's go ahead and get started. Minh Tsai.
And then I'll talk a little bit about and where we are as a company. I'll start by giving you we have about 80 employees. They're all local. We do about 8. My board said I should not divulge that number, so I cannot. And we've been profitable for the last few years because we've been building in that direction. We've existed for 10 years. And today, on a daily basis, we make about 30,000 pounds of tofu. So we're a relatively young and small company, despite the fact that we've been around for 10 years. Just a quick background on the tofu industry, and I'm talking about specifically tofu, not the entire soy industry. That distinction is important because tofu as a food is very different from all the soy food out there that is being used as protein. So tofu as an industry is relatively small. Currently, there are 3 big players in the industry that dominate 80% of the industry. They are all foreign companies, and they have been around for over 20 years, and they basically play in the commodity market from an economic standpoint, and they're all profitable. Why? And this is relevant in terms of why I started a tofu company. Tofu was introduced to the United States formally in the 1970s, even though it's been around in the Japanese and the Chinese enclaves for more than 100 years. But it was never formally a sort of a mass product or a public product until it was introduced by a gentleman named Bill Shirleft. And his background is also relevant to the industry. So Bill Shirleft, it's a product of the 50s. And he ended up going overseas to Africa as a Peace Corps volunteer. And this is during the time where there's tremendous poverty, and it still is, in that region of the world. After his Peace Corps experience, he went to Japan. And it was over there that he learned about tofu and this amazing plant-based food. And there he met his partner, and they decided to introduce this food to America. So if you cook or if you own any tofu book from the 70s, the 80s, even to the 90s, it's basically, we can give credit to Bill Sherleft. But today, he's basically, he's an archivist of all things tofu. Bill wrote this book called the Book of Tofu that was published in 1976. And in the book, and subsequent to all the publicity of the book, he introduced tofu as a vegetarian food, as a plant-based food that would save our planet. Does that sound familiar? We still hear it today. And so tofu was introduced as a plant-based food. So for those of you who have not grown up eating tofu, or your parents, or in some cases, your grandparents, what do you think their first experience with tofu was when they first read this book? Most likely, they're excited. This is in the 70s. They're like, this sounds great. There's this thick book, explains everything about tofu. There are no pictures, but a lot of beautiful drawings of tofu making equipment, tofu, what it looks like. So if you've never had tofu before, you can imagine, if you're adventurous enough, to go to an Asian enclave grocery store and try to seek out tofu. So let's say your parent go to a supermarket and it's looking for a white block somewhere on the shelf. And chances are, he or she will not find it because it was not packaged. And if he or she is brave enough to venture up to the register and say, tofu, because it's the same word then and now, the proprietor would most likely react this way. Ah, tofu. And then would reach somewhere down under him in a 5-gallon bucket, pull up a block of jiggly tofu, hopefully with some kind of a plastic bag over his hand. But if not, put it in a plastic bag, tie it up like a goldfish, and hand it to your parent to take home. Now, if your parents are familiar with a lot of cooking techniques, which I doubt at the time, then they would know what to do with tofu, but most likely, they would try to grill it, because we were introduced to tofu as a meat substitute. It's a vegetarian food. And so when your parents marinate the block of tofu and throw it on the grill, it's probably going to crumble and fall right through. Unfortunately, that was the first experience of a lot of people eating tofu. But fortunately for us Americans, we're very innovative. So we want to make tofu meat-like. And therefore, the next series of books about tofu will all say, in the very first chapter, bring tofu home, wrap it in paper towel, put some weight on it, and press it until it's firm enough for you to throw in the grill. Okay? So American Tofu Company started making firm tofu and extra firm tofu. So we invented firm tofu. And you all have probably eaten firm tofu. In fact, the sofritas in front of you is made with firm tofu. So because of our innovation, we made firm tofu, and we introduced firm tofu to the public. And it was meaningful for many reasons. One, now you can grill it. So it's easier to use. Two, it's also easier to transport and extend its shelf life. So that's the beginning of the tofu industry in America. Vegetarian food, firm tofu, mass production, and then scale and reach. Very similar to a lot of food that we grew up eating. That's the model. And of course, as a result, it becomes a commodity. The price of tofu today, it's just a little bit more than the price of tofu 20 years ago. You can buy a block of tofu for $2 today. You bought a block of tofu for $2 20 years ago. So, as a commodity, and somewhat of a mysterious commodity, most people are not exposed to where it comes from, how it is made. And so we have a couple of generations from the 70s to today whose experience with tofu is less than ideal from the culinary perspective. So this is a background of how I ended up starting Hodo Soy, is to take back tofu. I wanted tofu to taste good. And that trend or that theme, you'll hear me repeat throughout today's talk. So I started the tofu business. I'll talk a little bit about why. Because I couldn't find good tofu. But that's not the only reason. It was also at a time of my life where I decided that I didn't want to be a banker anymore. And I'll talk a little bit about why that's the case. It's more, so it's the business side and the personal side. I grew up in Vietnam, and we have a very different food culture there. You know, we tend to shop the same day, and we use it. So I grew up with my grandfather taking me to buy breakfast, my grandmother taking me to the market, like you go to the farmer's market and shop for that day. You know, there's a lack of refrigeration and all of that. Those are also reasons why we don't keep food for a long time. So I grew up eating really good tofu. And when I came to the US, I didn't think much about food, all the way until when I was in my late 20s, actually in this case, early 30s, when I became fascinated by food and taste. And I spent all my money on food. Like my credit card bill, 90% of it was on food. That's the reason why I started the food business. But I also was an investment banker. And as a banker, I was very good at it. In fact, this is a funny aside. A week ago, I saw a headline that says, Jes Staley to be CEO of Barclays Bank in the UK. And Jes Staley is a name that I actually mentioned many times about why I left investment banking. He's a great banker, and he was 2 levels removed from me when I was at JP Morgan and in the equity capital market group. And I was an associate, fresh out of school. He was the managing director of the group. So we actually technically should never connect. But then on December 23rd of 1996, and I remember this day very distinctly, I was about to get on a plane to go back to San Francisco, where my family was. And Jes Staley walked up to my cubicle and said, I need your help to work on a deal. And I looked up and I said, wow, the managing director of the group's talking to me. And I said, oh no. I said, actually, Jeff, I'm going home today, so I'm sorry, but I can't help you. And he said, okay, fine, just come back after Christmas and see me. And I said, and then he turned around and walked away. And I said, but Jeff, I'm actually not coming back until after the New Year. And then he said, he looked at me, he didn't say anything, and he walked away. And I panicked. So I went and looked for my boss, my VP, and I said to her, I said, I think I'm in trouble. I just said no to Jes Staley. And she said, you said no to Jes Staley? I said, I did. And she said, okay, just go home. I'll take care of this. So I had a terrible holidays. And I came back, and I was on the deal. It was a big deal. And for a whole month, it was very successful. And then after that, we all got our bonuses. And I realized that Jes was making a lot of money, and he loved what he does. And that's why he's able and willing to work over Christmas and the New Year. And I realized then also that I didn't care that much about money. I cared about a different set of lifestyle. So that was the beginning of why I sort of migrated out of finance. And I was also very curious about things beyond finance. So I left investment banking after I got my bonus. And I took some time off, and I decided to sort of follow my passion and my curiosity to learn about. So now I know about finance. Now I want to learn about operations. So I ended up becoming a management consultant for a few years. And then I realized that I did a lot of strategic plans for businesses that often don't use them. So after a few years of that, I went into software development. also financial software. So I kept going lower, sort of getting my hand deeper into operations. And then after doing that for about 4 years, continuing to sort of get deeper into the operational side of a business, the dot-com sort of debacle happened. This is actually in the early 2000s. And at the time, I was working for Charles Schwab, doing software development. This is where the time when financial software, like all the trading software, was happening. And Schwab was a great company. It still is today. But in 2002, Schwab had his first layoff ever in the history of the company. And this, to me, was already my third recession in the finance world. So I survived. I had great bosses, great mentors, and I was a good worker. And then a year later, they had a second layoff. And at that time, I also survived. But a lot of my peers, basically really capable peers, were let go. And I ended up working with some of the peers that I didn't think was, from a meritocracy standpoint, should inherit those roles. So that was my personal disillusionment of meritocracy in America. So, I came as an immigrant, I worked hard, I studied hard, worked hard, and now it's no longer the case. It's about who you know and the politics of work. So I was quite disillusioned, and I took a severance package and left the white-collar industry altogether, and decided to start a food business because I didn't want to deal with any more recessions. It's much more food-safe, recession-proof to do food. And so as I was looking for things to do in the food world, I decided upon tofu because of what I mentioned earlier. Because when I studied the history of tofu and the background, the economics of tofu, I realized that there was an opportunity to make a better tofu. And at the time, I had some good role models. This was around the time where chocolate was beginning to have sort of artisan chocolate. You have artisan coffee, artisan olive oil, artisan this and that. And I thought, why not artisan tofu? It was a crazy idea. I mean, I look back and all my friends, my family, they all said, why? And to be honest with you, it was a crazy idea. It's completely crazy. And our success today, I can attribute that to a lot of timing. I can also attribute that to how we have the integrity to sort of stand our ground as far as introducing a food and educating the public about tofu. So how did we go from that to where we are today? I started out by testing tofu, or learning how to make tofu in small tofu shops in the Bay Area. And by looking at what's on the market. And the commoditized tofu was everywhere. And people were not eating tofu because their first experience was generally not a positive one. And so I started making tofu that I myself find to be tasty. And I started selling at the farmer's market. Why the farmer's markets? At the time, the farmers' markets were places where people with disposable income, who were curious, who cared about the connection between food and commerce and the earth. So it's a great place to really launch a food business. So it wasn't just a great place for farmers and produce grower to sell produce. It was also the beginning of a lot of food entrepreneurs using it as a testing ground. So that's exactly what we did. And I made really good recipes, and I don't tell people it's tofu. I just go, try this. And people would eat it and say, wow, that's delicious, what is it? And I would say, it's tofu. And then they would say, no, it's not tofu. And then we'll have a debate. And then I'm convincing them that it is tofu, you just never had tofu like this before. So that's where we began to build a loyal customer base. In fact, we have Tracy in the room, she's one of our customers, she and her partner in Berkeley. And they've subsequently become one of our investors. So this is how we grew the business initially. We were able to test the business, and we were able to really gather a lot of data. So because of my background, I recognize that for me to grow this business, to grow it as a viable business, I need to think about it as a business and not just like one of these mom and pop business, because there are a lot of tofu mom and pop shops that are profitable. They're very distinct family-owned business. But I wanted to see if I can build something bigger. And so we went from 1 farmer's market to the peak of 12 farmer's markets. And we were able to sell as much as $1,000 worth of tofu in a 4-hour period at the farmer's markets, which is a lot of tofu if you think about it. But that's our experience. And using the farmer's markets to expand our brand and our reach to the retail consumer, but also the restaurant consumer. So our brand and the quality of the products began to grow. And that's how we slowly expanded our reach in the Bay Area. And it was through this whole network of farmers markets that we're able to also find the first group and the only group of investors to build our business. So we were able to do the first couple of years, $500,000 in sales just from the farmers markets, which is really substantial 10 years ago or 8 years ago. And that convinced me that there's a viable business if we are able to expand further and grow faster. And that's when I realized that, the same question that a lot of people ask now, which is, do you buy or do you build? Do you outsource a co-packer or do you build your own tofu? And at the time, to be honest with you, I was looking for co-packers because I knew there were so many risks to run a food business. From the food safety standpoint, from the employee safety standpoint, there are a lot of risks. But fortunately for me, there were no good co-packers out there because the big guys were too big to co-pack for us and also too big to make the quality that we wanted. So by default, we were forced to build our own plant. And fortunately, I was really interested in operations. So we ended up raising a round of funding and building a plant in Oakland that's still there today, that's churning out 30,000 pounds of tofu a day. Why Oakland? We looked everywhere. Oakland was meaningful for us because at the time, it was a city looking for businesses like ours. It's a city that had employment issues. It's a city that was willing to support small food business because Oakland has a great history of large food businesses. The infrastructure was there. Where our plant is, it's close to 3 freeways. So we ended up choosing Oakland for all those reasons. And we were also able to get some support, financial support in terms of non-interest loans to build our business. So that's a key reason that we chose Oakland. So we're very loyal to Oakland, and we're very loyal to the people and the employees at Oakland. So we chose Oakland to start the plant. And when we first started out, we were running 1 day a week. Now we run 5-6 days a week and double shift. When we first started out, we had 6 employees. Now we have about 80 employees. And I want to talk a little bit about the culture of the company. I don't know how much time I have before we move into the Q&A.
Five minutes.
Perfect. But this is the first time I'm actually talking about the culture of the company. And it's related to the reason that I alluded earlier about meritocracy. So because I left corporate America, because I was disillusioned, I wanted to do an experiment about meritocracy. So the commitment that we as a company make to employees from day one was the following. We promise to pay you well, as much as we can afford, okay? We promise that if you learn and grow, we'll keep giving you more responsibilities and raise your salary. We promise that if we don't grow fast enough, for you to continue to grow with the company, I will be responsible to help you get a job with a different company. Okay? And we want you, because we work with a large immigrant population, we want you to learn English. So we'll work around your schedule so you learn English. So basically, we have a workforce of labor, most of them immigrant. And we strive for a workforce that's diverse in terms of gender, even though tofu making is primarily a heavy lifting, semi-heavy lifting, male-oriented trade. We have about 50-50 male-female. We also strive for ethnic diversity. You know, generally, most tofu plants are run by Asians. We have about 40% Asians, and the rest are South Americans, Mexicans, so we strive for that as well. And in the labor industry, in the Bay Area and elsewhere, generally speaking, you have 100% turnover. In our company, we have less than 5%. So this is significant. Why? I think it's because of our culture. So today, we offer a really meaningful wage for our employees. We have 100% health insurance for them. We have dental insurance for them. We implemented this year a 401k program that we match 4%. So that's how we give back. And we're learning too. This is a social experiment that I started that I don't talk about because I'm always afraid that it's going to break as we grow. You know, you hear about, what was that software guy in Seattle that wants to pay everyone $75,000? And then, you know, one employee said, well, the other employee's not working hard enough to deserve $75,000. We have something similar too. You know, whenever there's a change, the employees would be, is it a fairness issue? So we deal a lot with the issue of fairness. So when we have employees who come, I spend a lot of time articulating our culture to them. And then when there's a misunderstanding or a gap, like an employee would come and say, I need to get paid more because of family circumstances and whatnot. We would engage in that conversation and say, well, you know, has the job changed? Are you happy here? The first question I usually ask is, are you happy here? And then the answer is usually yes. It's like, okay, has your job changed? The answer is usually no. So if your job hasn't changed and you're happy here, then why do you need more money? Because of some changes outside. We try to accommodate in most cases, you know, by making it flexible for people to stay home, take care of family members and whatnot. But generally speaking, when people leave us, it's because of external circumstances that requires them to make more money or to do something different, and not because of us. But we try to accommodate. So we engage in these types of really meaningful conversations and flexibility with our pool of employees. And it's one of the reasons why we have such a low percentage of turnover. And I'm really proud of that, and I hope that it will continue as we grow. And I'll say one more thing. So Hodo today, we've been in the West Coast. You probably haven't heard of us, but in the next few years, you're going to hear more about us because we just launched East Coast a few months ago, and we've seen tremendous interest in the New York, DC area. We already have about 80 accounts in about 3 months, grocery accounts. And you know, the restaurant and the media is really fascinated by not just our product mix, but our stories. So hopefully you see more of our brand out there and continue to eat the sofritas.
Thank you so much, man. That was wonderful. I think with a culture like that, I'd just be a little worried that you might get mobbed by people asking for jobs after this talk. We're gonna move into the moderated Q&A part of the discussion, and so Justin Freiberg again with the Yale campus West Farm will come up to moderate that.
Thank you so much, Min. So you've talked about the tofu itself, but in talking to you a few weeks ago, we were talking about some of the other byproducts of the tofu making process that in turn are wonderful products in their own right. I'd love for you to tell people a little bit about that and how you're capturing all the various potential revenues around tofu making. Then also, if you could talk about your sourcing and in turn some of the waste products that you are thinking about that are on your mind in the process.
Great. Those are great questions. So let's talk about specifically the tofu and the tofu making. You can Google Hodo Soy, and there's a lot of videos about how tofu is made. We're purposefully trying to educate people about tofu and how it is made and such. So tofu came from soybean. The first discovery of tofu is an accidental discovery, just like anything else. Somebody was making soy milk, cooking beans, rather, just like you would anywhere. You soak it overnight, you cook it slowly, and someone was cooking it just like that in China, and there was excess water, and he or she decided to add some flavor to that water because didn't want to waste it. First by adding soy sauce, which makes the milk taste salty, and then decided to add some vinegar, in which case the milk coagulate. And so it became a solid. And that's the discovery of tofu for you. So tofu is made very similarly today. First, we source soybeans. At Hodo, we work with more than 20 farmers in the US, and we contract them to grow soybeans for us. One of the things we try to do as a company from an ecological standpoint, and I won't go into the ecology of legumes and all that and how it benefits the planet, unless you ask me questions later. But, you know, because that's a different subject. But basically, we want people to grow as diverse the number of soybeans we use as possible. You know, there are more than 200 varieties of so-called soybeans out there. Today, we use less than 10 of them. And most of them are basically have been genetically modified. So at Hodo, what we encourage farmers to do that we work with is we say, we have two requirements. We have a protein and a fat requirement. If you have any heirloom seeds or any seed you want, in fact, we just did a test. You can grow them, grow small plots, because we can't use them all until we test them. So after you grow them and they meet our protein and fat requirement, we are committed to testing them and running a large quantity and buy from you if you meet these requirements. So the goal for us in doing that is to really get people to grow soybeans that are not just specific to tofu making soybeans. Okay, so we've started doing more and more of that now, and it's really fun. You know, we just tested a batch literally 2 days ago, and I got the report that it didn't yield the same as the ones we're using now. It's 20% less. So I'm trying to negotiate a meaningful price with the farmers that we still want to use it because we want you to grow it, and you need to make a few changes in terms of letting it dry longer for it to be more mature so the protein level goes up. So that we're committed to doing that. So that's where we source all of our beans in the US with the purpose of supporting American farmers and organic growers and extending the varieties of organic soybeans. And then in terms of tofu making, we ground it, and then we extract the milk from the beans, and we use that milk to make tofu. And we add a coagulant called calcium sulfate, which is one of three commonly used coagulants. We use calcium sulfate because it's the most traditional, and it's also the coagulant that does not mask the flavor of tofu. Because if you drink silk soy milk, it tastes like cow milk. We want it to taste like bean juice. We want to introduce bean juice to you, a delicious bean juice, okay? So I have hope that 30 years from now, when I'm old and gray, you'll be like, yeah, I love soy milk because of that guy, Min. He introduced it to me. But the idea is really, you know, people haven't had good experience with it. So we try to make a quality product that when you drink it, you taste the nuance of that soy milk. So we make a particularly thick soy milk. And the reason for that it has more protein and more fat. So if you eat our tofu, which is in the sofritas, that tofu has 50% more protein and fat than the conventional tofu you buy in the market. And the reason for that is I did not want it to make firm tofu because it's really hard to use and really hard to work with. So when I decided to make firm tofu, because all the chefs were begging me to make firm tofu for them, I decided that if I'm going to make a firm tofu, I need to make a firm tofu that tastes good after all the flavors are gone. Because conventional tofu, once the coating of flavor is gone, you have this chalky, weird thing in your mouth. And that's because of the fact that it's much more watered down. So from an economic standpoint, dollar per protein amount, we'll beat everybody. And that's what I'm trying to articulate when I articulate our tofu. So if you want taste, you have to pay for it, but it's not expensive. And that's how we ended up working with Chipotle. So after we make the tofu, we have the bean pulp, which is what we call the okara. And it's one of a very valuable byproduct. And it's more valuable in California now because of our drought and because of the price of organic feed going up. So we currently produce about 10 tons a day, and we sell it to dairymen to feed their cattle. But if any of you are interested in starting a food business, this is a great product. So if I were to start this whole thing over again, I would take the okara and turn it into a food company, because this product has protein, great fiber, very versatile. You can turn it into bacon bits, chips, wonderful like biscuits. We use it in our burgers. So it's a byproduct that a lot of people have, and it requires somewhat of a scale production to really make it economical. But this is one of the byproducts that I encourage people to think about, and I might do something with in the future. Super long answer.
Wonderful answers. Thank you.
So,
one more question before we open it up to everybody else. You mentioned at some point when we were discussing this a few weeks ago that tofu has yet to have its moment. I'm curious when that moment would be, like when you would assess the market and say it's finally having its moment. And if at that moment, what is the intersection between tofu as an Asian food, or a food that we think of as being used in Asian food, and when does it become American? When it's used in burritos, or when it's sold in Costco? And
great question. Maybe this is the moment. I'm talking at Yale. So yeah, this could very well be the moment. Seriously. Tofu, this year, we're starting an event called Tofu Disrupt. Okay? We are from Silicon Valley, after all. And the idea is the following. We tested one in San Francisco that was really successful. And here's the idea. Tofu was introduced to America as a vegetarian food. And I'm talking to you as a consumer, as a chef, as a journalist. Well, let's forget about that. Tofu is an Asian food. Yeah, tofu is pretty much in all the Asian restaurants in America. And you've probably had a lot of tofu in Asian restaurants, and all kinds of flavors, Asian flavors. Let's also forget about that. Let me introduce tofu to you from the liquid to the solid, from the beans to the okara, and everything in between. And I will introduce to you, as a chef, as a consumer, how it is made, its chemistry, its health elements, its ecology. But more importantly, I want you, as consumers, as chefs, as journalists, to think of it as a canvas. I want you to sort of take it and be innovative with it. We've done it, so now it's your turn to help us, to look at it as a traditional ingredient that has appeals beyond Asian cuisine. And we're seeing some results. We have probably more 3-star restaurants and 2-star restaurants using our tofu than any other tofu brand. And how do we succeed in doing so? It's A, from the education that I just mentioned. B, by using innovative products like we have yuba, which is a tofu skin that we introduced, and really helping chefs and culinary programs understand how to use tofu and why firm tofu is really difficult to use and why it didn't taste good. So we spent a tremendous amount of effort. Even though we're a small company, we do more of that than all three of the big companies. So that's how we win the hearts and the mind and extend our brand. And so I believe that it's only a matter of time when people's mindset will change, when they look at a product and they see it differently. And that's how we ended up with Chipotle. They first started out with Shop House, which is their Asian concept. And then throughout that year of working with the chefs and the management team, they recognized the versatility, because Chipotle actually originally wasn't going to use tofu in the restaurant. It was going to use a more processed soy protein. But then after working with us and understanding, who we are, the alignment was much greater in terms of their promise of food with integrity and our commitment to food with integrity. So that's how we ended up working together for the sofritas. So I think I'm a patient man, in food you have to be patient. So maybe a few more years, and we're going to do a Tofu Disrupt event in New York in the spring. And the two chefs that I'm talking to are classic culinary trained French chefs. So we'll see if they get involved.
I made a false promise, so I'm going to ask you one more question before.
Okay.
You mentioned being patient, and you're a patient man. And within the food business and being in the Bay Area, where expectations on returns on investment can be skewed towards tech companies and companies with very little upfront investment, what are your thoughts on realistic expectations for making food businesses, especially ones that look to create food with integrity? How do you make those ones move forward? How do we change the investment culture and the expectations around what it takes for a food business to get going?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I know we touched upon it briefly when you and I talked. I'm fortunate because I'm in this in-between space. And let me explain that. So when I started the business 10 years ago, and you'll recognize some of the brand that started around, like Blue Bottle Coffee was my neighbor. There's a cohort of us who basically launched our business at the farmers markets. And we're fortunate in that before us were a bunch of predecessors, role models in the Bay Area. I don't know, and even nationally, we have role models like Ben & Jerry ice cream, Scharfenberger chocolate. In the Bay Area, we have Acme bread. These are folks who built long-term business and successful businesses. And I tell people all the time, by the time you hear about Hodo, and you're like, oh yeah, that's a great tofu company. Their stuff is so good. You probably think that I've only been around for 3 years. But the truth is there's like 10 years of history before you hear about a food business, unlike a tech business. So you should use that same rule when you think about return of investment. Don't go into food if you want to make a quick buck, because it's really, really hard. Even the Hampton Creeks of the world are not making big bucks, and they get a lot of press. Okay, go into food because you have a passion for it. Go into food because 90% of your credit card bills on food. Go into food if you don't want to deal with recessions, because the cycle of recession will happen. It's inevitable. So for me, and right now in the Bay Area, there's a lot of tech money in food. So there's that connection as well. And you're beginning to see those that have been around 3+ years really suffering. Like Good Egg, you guys heard of Good Egg? So that started out with a lot of press, with a great model, with money from Google, and it's really shuttering its door. So like everything else, there will be some consolidation. But I think the way that we've been successful is we have wonderful investors who actually understand our models. They're like, we love your food, we're patient, because we get where you're going. We're proud to be associated with you and the brand, and not just looking specifically at how quickly we're going to get our ROI. So that's a wonderful way to attract people, like-minded people, smart money, as you would call it. So for us, and in the Bay Area in general, I think when it comes to food, you have to have a longer view. and you have to make sure your investors recognize that you're going to continue to grow and prove your success. But it's going to take 10, 12, 15 years for a food business to have a meaningful return. So.
Great. Yes.
Thank you very much for speaking. I'm also actually leaving my job right now to start a food business. It's actually great listening to you. And right now my question is that I'm in that weird time period where I just left my job and I know nothing about the food business, to be honest. I just wonder if you can tell me and us how exactly do you go about this? What do you learn about? How do you make sure that a food like tofu, which is an ethnic food, can be introduced to Americans and be popular? Thank you.
That's a good question. I think there's a lot of risks. When I talk to folks who are starting food business today, the first thing, the landscape of food business then and now, it's also changed. You have many more regulations in terms of food safety, and on one hand, which makes it really much more challenging. The distribution network is also very different today than it was 10 years ago. But you also have more money interested in food, which is also advantageous. I don't know what food business you're starting, but my suggestion is you need to figure out whether you want to make it. Like, do you love making the food? Do you love to run operations? Or do you love the idea of selling this food? I see so many entrepreneurs who have a great recipe that they can make at home on a benchtop. And they all their friends love it, and they want to launch it. And they realize that at the next level of scaling, they hate operation. They just want to hand that off to somebody and just be the front man of selling that food. And they can be very successful salespeople. But somebody else is making their food. And when you mass produce the food, quality usually diminishes. So you have to be concerned about that. So my suggestion to you is make sure your food is continuously really delicious, if not continuously getting better and better. Like our tofu today, it's actually tastier than our tofu when we first started out. And we're making more of it, and we're extending its shelf life. It took a lot of work to be able to do that. It's so easy to make a lot of innovative small dishes, but to mass produce it and keep the quality, it's the biggest challenge, not to mention all the food safety aspect of it. So I would say figure out what you love and then determine whether this food that you're making can have a broad reach. Is it perishable or is it not? What's the demographic? And don't be too concerned about the ethnicity part, because I think we are in a landscape that's changing as well. Ethnic is very hip now, and it is mainstream to a certain extent. So, yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions? Let's just throw it to the other part of the room, right over there.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about. Sure. Your name, where are you from? Yeah. My name's Zach. I'm here at the School of Management, and there are a lot of meat substitute companies that are coming out, kind of engineered, proteins of some sort. And I was wondering if you could talk about how you see that as a competitor to your company, or do you not even consider that food, and does it not concern you? I mean, just can you tell maybe your opinions on that?
That's a great question. I can talk all day about it. Yes. So I look at the mock meat or the texture protein market as a competitor, B, an ally, and C, as a way for people to learn about food. Here's why. They're competitors because a lot of them use soy protein powder, which is highly processed. So there's I've written a whole thing about where soy protein comes from. I'll spend 1 minute on it so you can time it. It was invented in 1953 by an amazing African-American scientist named Dr. Julian. You can look him up. There's a whole documentary about him. But it was invented as a paper coating and as a paint product. So for 15 years after the invention of soy protein isolate, it was never used as food until somebody came along and thought, cheap powder, I can add flavor, found texture, and turn it into food. So there are a lot of mock meat company that's using chemistry and processes to make texture product. I think the public will eventually figure that out and recognize that. I'm actually friends with them. I've advised them, I've consulted for them, but I do it for free. I don't take any equity from them at all. And I think there's currently a split. We are making a whole traditional food. We're going to open our process for you to look at. How are they as not as competitors, but they're making people aware of vegetarian food and non-meat protein. So it rises all boats. So for me, but I think with the proliferation of information on food and curiosity of the millennials, of people wondering like where food comes from, you're going to see people will be very quick to recognize like, okay, I love this taste, I love this texture, but I probably shouldn't eat a lot of it. So I think people will make those decisions. And the millennials love to decide things themselves. So we're going to let them. Yeah.
Yeah, right there in front.
Hi, man. My name is Reed. I'm part of a northern Chinese food startup in town. And I'm curious to hear, of the groups that are resistant to trying tofu, which groups in America you think are most resistant and which would actually be open if they were put in the right context of experiencing it?
That's a good question. I think there's still a lot of misinformation, specifically about soy and health. Okay? Because tofu, when it was introduced, it was introduced as a health food, as a vegetarian food. And then in the 80s, there was a lot of misinformation about how soy is bad for you. And anything is bad for you in mass quantity. If you look at research on soy, on animals, I think the most recent one I read was actually done out of Harvard. And it was disappointing because they were feeding mice, I think 500x the amount of soy protein that a normal mouse or human should consume, and discover that it reduces their sperm count. And I just roll my eyes coming out of Harvard, unfortunately, because it shouldn't have happened that way. You know, like you feed any animal 500x whatever you're supposed to consume on a daily basis, they're gonna have some issues. So the way I talk about tofu specifically is I look at Asia. We in Asia consume roughly 2 to 3 ounces on average of tofu daily. We have a culture here where if it's good, you eat a lot. If it's bad, you don't eat it. We are so extreme. So it's our job when people come up to our farmers markets booth or come up to me and say, my chiropractor, my doctor tells me, you know, I shouldn't eat tofu. My first answer is you should listen to them. You know, I don't try to sell you what you don't think you should eat. So I think people have to be willing to look for the information themselves, be able to distinguish the difference between tofu and all the mock meats out there, and how they impact them, because everyone is individuals. So for us, we just want to make it taste good. We want to make sure that the recipe and the ingredients are pure and clean and organic, and we'll just put it out there, and hopefully that's enough. So, yeah.
Yes, anybody else? Right there.
Can you talk a bit about putting your team together when you were first starting and like who you hired and what did you think were like the key additions that you needed and how that worked?
That's a great question. My business partner is actually, I met randomly. He's MBA. He called me out of the blue and he said, I like what you're doing. I want to join you. And this is when I had 3 farmers markets. And I said, John, man, I looked at your resume. You worked in Asia. You speak Chinese, blah, blah, blah. But guess what? I can't afford you. So you have to come on and do a farmer's market if you want to join this. And he called me back and he said, sure, let's do it. So he worked with me for a couple of years and then we became business partner. It's a great question. It's the hardest thing for me to solve, is how do I find people that understand the culture and understand that change is the constant and understand that we're slow moving. You're going to make money, but it's not going to be overnight. So we are beginning to attract more competent and capable, I would call professional, because I'm not one. So we don't have a lot of professionals in our company. Like we have 2 formal architects working for us in business development. Career change. I'm a career change. I love career change people. As long as you're smart and you're willing to learn, that's what I'm committed to. But as we grow now, I think a level of senior managers, we're going to start looking for them, particularly in operations. We'll train people in operations. Food operation it's really fascinating if you like it. You learn about all kinds of processes and audits and food safety and production and machinery. So that's a layer that I need to hire next. We have a great team of management in terms of strategies and marketing. We don't actually have a lot of marketing. This is the first year that we're spending marketing dollars, and last year was the first year we had a salesperson. So most of our sales comes from word of mouth and referrals. So we're very fortunate, and it's not typical. You know, it just happened that, come on, tofu. If you Google tofu, there's not a lot of tofu company that's going to pop up, and we generally tend to be percolating to the top. And when you're like, oh wow, you know, they're good customer service, they make good tofu. So we generally become the first, the tofu of choice for a lot of people who want to use tofu. So, but that level of management it's where I need help the most to grow our business. Yeah.
Min, I have a question about that's kind of tied between operations and distribution, as well as growing the overall market share. So, say if a goal is to have, what would it take to get Hodo tofu or any tofu as like a good selling product on like a McDonald's dollar menu, right? And for me, you tell me if this is wrong, but I would assume that there's some consumer education that still needs to be had to adapt the tofu to the average palate in America. It's still a substitute food in a lot of people's mind, not just another choice.
Right.
Where do you see, you mentioned earlier expanding to the East Coast. You've got a great product. You've said you've improved the taste and the chemistry, and you're happy with how you've maintained quality at scale. But now the distribution becomes a really hard thing to do. When you expanded to the East, you said, we've got 80 accounts in grocery stores. Where do you balance do we get chefs to buy this first in order to get, because chefs drive a lot of the food trend. And we said, do we aim for chefs first and then get it in the grocery stores? And is that distribution model easier or more, is that cheaper to get that distribution chain than going through the grocery route? I'm interested in comment on that.
Distribution is always challenging for many reasons. One is really disjointed. You have, it's kind of like telecom before. You have the big guys, and then they outsource to the little guys, the last mile. So distribution is always going to be challenging for any food business, and in particular for perishable food. The shorter the shelf life, the more challenging it is. And we're only able to be here because we now have a pasteurized product that has a guaranteed 60-day shelf life. And you need minimum 60 days to start talking to distributors when it comes to food. That's why you can look at it as barrier to entry. You can look at it as a challenge in terms of growth. And that applies more on the retail level. As far as food service and restaurants, I think what you said is exactly what I'm trying to do. Is we've always had a very diverse approach. Chipotle is our biggest customer, but it's not like if Chipotle goes away tomorrow, we'll be fine. Don't go away, Chipotle. No. But at the same time, we're looking at other of the chains as well. How do we grow? How do we support a growth of a chain restaurant? A lot of education for sure, but the economic needs to make sense as well. But ultimately, it really comes down to taste. I think people have to eat something and say it tastes great. And so that's a big focus as far as food service and restaurants. So we have a lot of tastemakers that are helping our brand. And the Tofu Disrupt event, it's really meant for that, to educate and get people to understand that it's now beginning to bleed into the mainstream. So, good?
Well, yeah, I think, fortunately we've run out of time. I'd like for everyone to join me in thanking Minh. And thanking Justin as well for moderating. It's great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We will continue the series in December, still to be confirmed, but most likely you should be hearing about that the next week or so. Thank you.